Have you ever opened the fuel tab in Holley, looked at all the tables and settings, and wondered what order you're supposed to tune everything in? You'd be surprised how many people get totally lost and give up on tuning right here, but it doesn't have to be that way. So in this video, I'm going to show you the exact steps to dial in your fuel tuning from start to finish using a simple method that you will actually remember so you can do more tuning and less overthinking. Now, before we start this process, we want to make sure that the car is up to normal operating temperature. This part is very important, so don't skip this step. If you're new to tuning, the size and the amount of these fuel tables and settings can be completely overwhelming, but then it gets even worse when you realize that most of these tables and settings work in conjunction with one another. So what can end up happening is you spend hours perfecting, one of these tables just to realize that you created a new problem somewhere else once the driving conditions change or the temperatures change. Sounds exhausting, right? Let me walk you through the exact workflow I use every time I tune a car to avoid that frustration. It's also an acronym, so it's pretty hard to forget. Are you ready for it? It's called farts. I told you it would be memorable, and yes, I'm aware that I'm about as mature as a 9-year-old, but this whole thing really does work. Before we're ready to start farting, you will have already needed to have run through the wizard or created a base map. Basically, we'll be starting from a point where the car at least starts and runs. If you need help with the workflow and getting to that point, you can download my 8-step roadmap below. So the F in farts stands for fuel table. And the fuel table is really the star of the show when it comes to all of this tuning. It's going to take the most time to tune, and it's the base for most of the other tables to work off of. So long story short, you have to get this right in order for all of the other tables to work properly. I'll show you an example as of why that is shortly. So when it comes to the fuel table, think of it as using an axe to cut down a huge tree. You don't just expect to swing the axe once and knock the entire tree down. You swing it numerous times, taking numerous little chunks out each time. So at this stage in the farts process, we are just taking our first few swings with the axe. We're not trying to get it perfect. We're trying to get it drivable and as close as we can within reason, without trying to hit every individual cell, as we'll be coming back to this shortly. So at this stage, we're still stationary with the car in your garage or whatever. What I would recommend doing is figuring out where the car idles, getting that good. Then we want to just slowly give it some throttle to try to avoid going into acceleration enrichment or anything like that, but just slowly rev the vehicle up. And at this point, I would say there's no real reason to go anything above, 3,000, 3,500 RPM or so. So we're going to try and get about as much as we can of this part of the table. Again, we're just trying to get it to run good at this point. So once we're able to slowly rev the engine cleanly, it's time for the A in farts, which stands for acceleration enrichment. So if we click on acceleration enrichment, you can see we have multiple different tables. Might seem a little bit confusing, but this one is coolant temperature based. This one's coolant temperature based. This one is coolant temperature based, and this one is map based. So at this stage, we don't need to touch any of these. I would just worry about this one here and this one here. Typically, I find that this is the one that seems to make the biggest difference, and this is based off of the TPS rate of change. So when the engine is running, just blip the throttle and watch the ball move through the table. If it stumbles, hesitates, any of that, just, again, follow the ball, make your changes there. You have these two tables that are going to make the biggest difference. Again, this one is the rate of change of the throttle, and then this one is based off of actual throttle position. So again, if we're stationary, most of our throttle is going to be in this area right here. Now, it's physically impossible to tell you how to tune all of these tables in one video.
I don't have time to explain it now. It will take too long.
And this video is more so to give you a walkthrough on the order in which to adjust all of these things. So the main thing that we're trying to do at this stage is to make sure that if we rev the engine or if we try to leave a stoplight or anything like that, that the car is actually going to accelerate. It's not going to spit and sputter. And that way we can drive it down the road without worrying about getting blasted into by an 18-wheeler or something. So now that the car starts, idles, and revs, the next step is for the R in farts, which is road test. Or if you have access to a dyno, this is a great time to use that. Before I bother strapping a car down on the dyno, I kind of go through all these steps to make sure that it runs good enough to justify putting it on the dyno. And of course, if you don't have a dyno, you want to make sure that it's going to drive safe enough to actually be able to take it down the road. Now that the vehicle is drivable, we're going to go back to the F and we're going to try to tune as much of the fuel table as we possibly can. You can use the learn table if you want, but I have much better and faster results doing this manually. But again, I've done it a million times. So it can also be really hard if you're driving the car by yourself on the street. So use your judgment here, do whatever you feel the most comfortable with. And this is sort of like the base, and so many of the other tables feed off of this table. So if we don't get the main fuel table correct, it's going to be difficult for all of the other tables to work correctly as well. Now, just how I mentioned the X earlier to cut down the tree, we want to do that with the main fuel table here as well. It's very difficult or even borderline impossible to knock out the whole fuel table all at once, learn table or not. A lot of people think they got to populate the entire learn table in one go. You don't at all. So again, I would break it down into sections. I usually do idle, and then I'll do cruising where we're just, lower speed stuff. And then we get into where we're giving a little bit more throttle, that kind of like acceleration zone. And then eventually you're going to get to the point where you're doing, full throttle sweep style runs. But again, just tackle these pieces individually is going to make your life a whole lot easier. Now, once you're happy with the fuel table, go back to the A in farts and start tweaking your acceleration enrichment until you're happy with that. Now that you've made big adjustments to the fuel table, it's very possible that the acceleration enrichment will need to be gone through again. Or it is also very possible that the acceleration enrichment doesn't need to be touched after you mess with it the first time. But at the very least, you just need to verify where you're at so that you know if you're in good shape or not. Just one other thing to mention is that the acceleration enrichment is usually very forgiving. So you can be pretty far away from perfect, yet the car will still run just fine. But either way, it is important to get this ironed out before we get to the T in farts.
So share the piece in the way that you'd like to.
So now that we have the primary fueling dialed in as far as the fuel table and the acceleration enrichment, it's time for the T in farts, which is our target air fuel ratio. I always start with a richer than expected target air fuel ratio, especially full throttle. And I don't start experimenting with new target air fuel ratios until the fuel table is dialed in and the acceleration enrichment is dialed in. That way, when we are experimenting with new target air fuel ratios, we're getting nice, clean, real results. When you're testing target air fuel ratios with, big, huge corrections, maxed out learn tables, sloppy acceleration enrichment, all of that stuff, it makes it very hard to validate things like fuel economy, which will be very helpful when we're choosing our target air fuel ratios. When it comes to the full throttle stuff, a dyno is really helpful when you're choosing the air fuel ratio that the car wants. Reading spark plugs can tell you if the engine is happy, but a perfect looking spark plug doesn't always result in the most horsepower. And some cars end up liking really goofy air fuel ratios that you wouldn't even consider getting to that point unless you were on a dyno. But luckily, even without a dyno, target air fuel ratio is probably the most straightforward part of this whole process. Usually as lean as we can get it, where the car is still happy for cruising, idle for fuel economy reasons. And for full throttle, we're trying to find the most horsepower and keep it safe. If you think you just need this one air fuel value and you don't test, you're probably going to be leaving some power on the table. Now, just so you don't think that this is a one and done, you very well may go through the fart part of farts numerous times before you're ready to move on. If it's taking you a long time, don't get frustrated. This is perfectly normal, especially if you're new to tuning. Honestly, it probably just means that you're trying to do a good job where most people expect to spend an hour on the entire tune and then wonder why their cars run bad. So the more you do this, the more you will learn how to anticipate what the car is going to want to do 10 steps ahead of where you are right now, which really speeds things up, which is pretty typical of how practicing anything works. So that brings us to the S in farts.
What? Sorry.
Which is startup fueling. I personally treat the startup and warm-up fueling as its own separate thing, and typically it's basically the last thing that I do in the tuning process. But again, before you can try to dial in any of this stuff, it's mandatory that the fuel table and the acceleration enrichment table are both tuned to the best of your ability. Everything that we've done up to this point, we've done at normal operating temperature, and everything we're about to do from this point is all going to be coolant temperature based. So in other words, most of this stuff is just a modifier of the primary tables. And this is why I said earlier that you have to tune the base table as close to perfect as you can. If the base table is wrong, then all of this other stuff is going to be wrong. And what happens is you just end up running around in circles doing the same things over and over again, because you change one thing, this thing breaks. You change this thing breaks. And you'll just run around in circles until you drop dead. The nice part about the startup and the warm-up enrichment is that it's very forgiving. The downside is that there are a lot of tables and a lot of adjustability here. So it seems a little bit intimidating, but let me walk you through the order that you should do it in and give you a couple tips. The first thing I'm gonna take a look at is not actually part of the startup procedure, but it is kind of grouped in with all the temperature related stuff, which is our air temperature enrichment. Generally speaking, these values are usually pretty close. So you have two options here. The first I would say is to leave these default values. You can see it's removing a little bit of fuel when the air temperature is really high. It's adding fuel when it's really cold. Scientifically, mathematically, that's the way that it's supposed to be. So you can leave the defaults, tune everything, and then as the air temperature changes, you can come back and make changes if needed. The other option, love it or hate it, is you could set all of this to 100 and eliminate the air temperature enrichment altogether. You would want to go back and then later adjust the air temperature enrichment. The only reason I even suggest doing that is I see with a lot of beginners that they'll have like 10 different modifiers all going on at the same time. Some are positive, some are negative, and they're trying to do all this crazy math. It's just kind of overwhelming. So this table, you can see it's not adding or subtracting very much fuel. So if you just wanted to get it out of the equation temporarily, that's something that you can do. So when it comes to startup and warm up, you might think air temperature makes the most sense because it's cold outside. My air temperature sensor is going to pick that up and we're going to make our changes based off of that. But the coolant temperature sensor is actually the star of the show here. The air temperature sensor is too easily manipulated, really. You can start a car, it can run for 5 seconds, and the air temperature can go up significantly from underhood temps, things like that. Coolant temperature is a much more accurate way of doing it, hence the reason all of these tables are going to be coolant temperature based. So usually before I start messing with any of the startup or warm-up stuff, I go through the whole fart process that we've talked about up to this point, and then I'll try to let the car cool off overnight if I can. You have a very small window of time to do this before the car gets too much heat in it, and then you got to basically wait almost until the next day to do it again. So now that the car is cooled all the way off, I tend to go through the startup enrichment just basically down the line here. The cranking fuel is actually very forgiving. As long as it has enough fuel, it will usually fire up. Sometimes it can be a little bit sloppy and you might need to tweak it in, but you'd be surprised how far off you can be on this and it'll work just fine. So as we've established, to get to this point, the car already starts and runs. So you may or may not even need to make adjustments here. And the default settings down here are usually in the ballpark. The fuel prime percentage and the cranking fuel are two different things, so use them accordingly. The after start hold off, this is kind of the transition from the cranking fuel to the after start enrichment. This, you probably won't even need to adjust this. This one isn't all that important. The after start enrichment is actually very important. This is usually the one when I say that I'm dealing with cold start. This is like the primary table that we're addressing, that one, and then there's another temperature-based one that we'll show as well. This, again, is coolant temperature-based. So essentially, this is directly after the car cranks and gets up to running speed, and then it's going to stay active for this long. So we're cranking, we're transitioning to our after start, and our after start is active for this long. So once the engine's warmed up, it's only about 7 seconds. So you can see you got to run through this stuff pretty quickly. Again, this is coolant temperature based, so you're going to need to tweak the values at the different coolant temperatures. So you might have to run through this whole process multiple times, different seasons, so on and so forth. So once we've made it through this section, we go into temperature enrichment, because at this point, the engine is now running. So now that we are in temperature enrichment, you got a decision to make. So the first table that I would look at here would be your air fuel ratio offset. If you want to let closed loop make changes during warm-up, then it's going to be very important that you set up the air fuel ratio offset to match whatever it is that you want. I do not use closed loop during warm-up, so technically this table doesn't really have much an effect the way that I use it. However, even still, I'll try to match this to the target air fuel ratio that I want. So the way this is going to work is it's going to take your main target air fuel ratio table, And then it's going to subtract or add, if you decided to do that, from there based off of the coolant temperature. Again, I try to keep this as lean as we can to keep spark plugs happy and all of that, but the engine still needs to run happy. So as you can see from the way that this is laid out, typically the colder the temperature, the more fuel you're going to need. Now that we have our target air fuel ratio offset set up, the next thing that I'm going to go into is going to be the coolant temperature enrichment. And this is different than the after start enrichment. This is essentially happening after the after start enrichment has decayed out. So this is purely based off of temperature and not time. So again, you're going to have to go through this. But what's nice about this one is if you started the car when it's here at 0 degrees, you can just, as it warms up, you can progressively make changes to all of these to get where you want. So the goal here is we're trying to get our actual air fuel ratio to match our target air fuel ratio as the car is warming up. Again, if you have closed loop turned on, it's going to try and make these corrections for you. If not, then obviously it's not, and it's going to be up to you to be making the changes. The big thing to remember as we're in the S section of farts here is that we have already tuned the main fuel table at normal operating temperature. So any fuel changes that need to happen, they all need to be done through these modifier tables. So don't go back and touch the main fuel table during this whole process because, again, it's already been set up, it's already correct. So we're dealing with temperature-related errors at this point. Now, one more thing worth pointing out here is that this is Sniper software, and you can see our coolant temperature enrichment is essentially a 1D table. If we go into the Terminator X, you can see that our coolant temperature enrichment and our air fuel ratio offset are 2D tables. So we can actually make changes here off of manifold pressure over here on this side. So manifold pressure, coolant temperature. And this actually ends up being very helpful as we're revving the engine. If the engine is cold, obviously you should try to warm the engine up as best you can before you go revving on it like a maniac. But I don't know, sometimes you don't have choices, or depending on what it is, you might need to have different fueling requirements between just idling or cruising. It doesn't even necessarily have to be the full throttle. So as you can see, the way that this is currently set up, this is the same throughout all the different manifold pressures, but we could do something like this just so you can visually see how this is different. So you can see now we are adding more fuel as the manifold pressure goes up. But this coolant temperature enrichment is one of the more important ones, I think. Now, the last piece of this is I will typically work out the coolant temperature enrichment and let the car warm all the way up without touching the throttle, just, sitting in park or whatever. This is, again, typically based off of however you're going to use the car. But most of myself and most of my customers, anything high performance like this, we're going to let it warm up before we start driving it. So I'll go through all of this. And then the last piece of the puzzle is we'll go back to our acceleration enrichment. And then this AE TPS versus coolant temperature is where we got to start revving the engine maybe a little bit more than you even feel comfortable with, just to make sure that our acceleration enrichment is still in line at all of the different coolant temperatures. And unless it's a super odd combination or something like that, you're going to find that the shape is usually very similar between most combos. Then absolutely last, if you find that you need or want to use the map-based acceleration enrichment, basically the AE versus TPS, I think is more of like a harsh adjustment, and then the map-based is more of a fine adjustment. You can actually zero this out and most cars will run just fine. You just need to use a little bit more for the TPS based. So it depends on how you want. But long story short, if you want to or are planning on using the map-based rate of change, then you still have your coolant-based offset here. And then this one is coolant-based as well. So you may need to go back and tweak on those. But again, these don't seem to be nearly as critical as the TPS-based rate of change. Most ECUs don't actually have the map-based rate of change, or if so, it might be happening in the background, but you might not have adjustability over it. So now you know how to use farts to guide you through the fuel tuning process. It can be tedious. You might have to run through it multiple times. And there's a lot of stuff that we looked at and covered that we didn't go into deep detail on exactly what it is or how to set it up. If you would like more information on that, I do offer a training course with, I think it's 250 videos, something like that, and counting. So if you would like more information on that, you can check out this video here.